guys, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and today I thought I would do an update for you. Last summer I did a video on water glassing eggs, and I never really updated you guys on how it went, and today I was getting ready to do another batch and thought it was the perfect time to kind of share my experience with using water glassed eggs. So a lot of people don't know that chickens do not typically lay eggs year-round. Here in Ohio where I am, my chickens will stop laying anywhere from late November to late December. It's kind of different every year depending on when the chicks hatched and what the weather conditions are like. And then they don't typically pick up laying again until the end of January, sometimes the end of February. Our chickens this year, it was the end of February when they started laying again, and right now at the end of March they are going crazy here. So a chicken's ability to lay eggs has a lot to do with the number of sunlight hours. So in the winter, as the days get shorter, their bodies rest from laying eggs, and that's actually good for them. A lot of people will put artificial light in their coops, and that will stimulate them to continue laying eggs throughout the winter months. And no judgment, everybody does different things for whatever that they like to do with their own animals. Here we don't have electricity run out to our coops, so a light isn't an option, and so we just let the chickens have a little rest, and unfortunately that just means that we don't have eggs for a month or two. So what I have to do every year is preserve some eggs so that we have some for eating, and in previous years I would try freezing them with varied results. So I've tried it a number of different ways. I've done it with the whites and the yolks separated. So I froze just the whites and I froze just the yolks. And I found that the whites froze very well. They were good. When they thawed, they were a good texture. They cooked up just fine. The yolks, when I froze them separately, the texture of them were terrible. They would thaw and they would just be rubbery and disgusting. And so that method didn't work. Then I tried doing them together but not mixed, and we had the same problem. The whites were a good texture, but the yolks were too rubbery to use really for anything. So then another year I tried scrambling them and freezing them together, and they were okay for baking. We would thaw them and we would use them in our baked goods and the results would be great. But in terms of thawing those eggs and eating them scrambled eggs, there definitely was a different flavor to them that we didn't enjoy. So last year I decided to try something brand new to us, an old-fashioned method that our ancestors used for preserving eggs. It's perfectly safe, and we had great results last year. So basically what you do is you take a solution of water and lime. You do 1 quart of water to 1 ounce of lime. This is calcium lime. It's kind of like garden lime, but this is a food grade kind. And I get mine in bulk from Azure Standard. But you just take 1 ounce of this, you mix it around in some water, you find yourself a bucket, you put it in there, and you put your eggs in, and it preserves them. So, all right, so let's talk about my experience doing this last year and the things I'm going to change this year. So what I did last year is I started preserving them in late June. Anytime we would bring in our basket of eggs, I would pull out any of them that were perfectly clean. You don't want to put any yucky, dirty, poopy eggs into your cow lime mixture, or it's going to create an environment of bacteria that may not be the healthiest for your eggs. So what I would do is just pull out any of them that were perfectly clean and put those in the bucket, and then I would save any dirty eggs for us for eating. I would wash them and then we would eat them. And that worked well. We ended up with about 7 dozen eggs by the end of the year. We didn't preserve many because I wasn't sure how it was going to work out and I didn't want to waste a ton of eggs. So those 7 dozen eggs or so, I had used a 5-gallon bucket that's rather large. Now, what I'm going to change this year is instead of using a 5-gallon bucket, I want to use smaller buckets, because what happened is we used the newest eggs first, the ones that were sitting on the top. And by the time February rolled around, when we were using the last of the water glassed eggs, we realized the ones on the bottom were the very oldest, and the weight of all of those 7 dozen eggs, like crushing down on the ones on the bottom, there were some that had cracked and we weren't able to use. And so what I'm going to do from now on is use smaller containers and fill them up and label them with the date so that I can use the oldest ones first and not have this gigantic bucket with really old eggs on the very bottom that I can't get to. And so I think this method is going to work a little better for us this year. That's my one thing that I'm really going to change. The other thing I'm going to change is I'm going to be preserving way more. I only did 7 dozen last year because I didn't start until June. I'm starting now in the end of March in our very heavy egg season in the hopes that we can preserve triple that for next year. Because last year I only used our water glassed eggs primarily for baking, and we didn't have enough to use for scrambled egg breakfast. So my hope is that this year we'll have enough preserved so that we can have them for baking and have scrambled eggs a couple times a week through the winter months. So that's the goal. That's what I'm going to do today. And let me show you which eggs I'm going to be using and which eggs I'm not. When they're laid are covered in a protective layer called a bloom, and that prevents bacteria from permeating the shell and getting into, to the edible part of the egg. It keeps them nice and fresh. And so an unwashed egg with that bloom intact can actually sit out on your counter for weeks and weeks and be perfectly fine. It doesn't need refrigerated. The minute you wash that protective layer off, that egg is now susceptible to bacteria getting through to the egg. So if you wash them and put them in your fridge, you're going to need to eventually use those up. Now the refrigeration will preserve them for a while, but they are not going to last indefinitely in the fridge. And it's the same idea with the water glassing. If I really, really scrub off that protective bloom, I'm just leaving the egg that much more vulnerable. And obviously, if you're sticking an egg in a water solution, some of that bloom can possibly come off, but I'm not trying to scrub it off, if that makes sense. So I'm looking for perfectly intact eggs that are perfectly clean with the bloom intact, and those are the ones that I'm going to stick in my bucket. So right now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to sort through the dirty ones. I'm going to set aside. We're going to wash those out and get those in the fridge to eat. The perfectly clean ones are going to go in this bucket, and we're going to get these preserved and ready for winter eating. All right, we've got them all done. This bucket right here, which holds, this is a 9-pound bucket. I believe this is a gallon bucket. This will hold 36 eggs, so 3 dozen. That's a good amount. And so that, I believe, would be a good amount. If I pulled one of these off of the shelf, that would leave me a couple dozen to use for a breakfast in the winter, and then another dozen that I could use for a week for baking. And so this is a good amount. What I'm going to do is fill this now. Let's see how much of the cow lime mixture I can fit in one of these buckets with all of the eggs in here. Here I've got my 1 quart of water. I measured out on my little kitchen scale here 1 ounce of cow lime, and I'm just kind of mixing that solution together. And I'm going to pour this over. Alright, so that worked perfectly. So once again, this little 1-gallon bucket, it fit me 3 dozen eggs, and it fit about 2 quarts of this solution perfectly. And so I'm just making sure that all of the eggs are submerged here. I'm going to take my lid, I'm going to pop it on, just kind of clean this bucket up a little bit, and then I'm going to label the outside with today's date. So on the top, I'm just going to write, what is today? March 24th, 3 dozen. And then I know I can just put this in the back of my pantry, and then I'll know that this is one of the first buckets that I'm going to pull out in December when we need eggs. Perfect. That bucket I got, I order my nut butter, my sun butter, in those 9-pound quantities, and those are the buckets they come in, so I'm just saving those to use for water glassing. But any kind of container could work. I'm thinking that if I wanted to do smaller amounts, if I just wanted to water glass, you know, 4 eggs to have for a specific recipe, I could even use little canning jars and make up my solution and pour it in and have the jars up on my pantry shelf. And then when I want to bake a cake or whatever in December, I can just pull 4 or 5 eggs out of a jar off the shelf. And I feel like that's a much more convenient way to preserve these than doing a big old bucket. Because you have to reach your hand all the way down, and you risk cracking the eggs in the bottom when you stir them around too much. And so I think this will solve those issues. Okay, so just to answer a few other questions that I had been asked about my experience with water glassing when I posted about it on Instagram. Yes, it is normal to have a bunch of the calcium sediment kind of at the bottom. It does settle that way, and it doesn't affect the preservation process. That's perfectly normal, and it won't affect the eggs that are at the bottom that sediment is settled on. They're still perfectly safe to eat. You do want to make sure when you pull the eggs out of the mixture, just make sure you wash it off before you go ahead and crack it, because you don't want to get that cow lime mixture in the food that you're eating. So we do always make sure we rinse those off. I did notice that from my eggs, there was a difference in the way the yolk held up in some of the different eggs. So I would crack some, and the yolk would immediately kind of run. And it smelled fine and it tasted fine. It wasn't a bad egg. We still used it, but the yolk was not firm. And then I would crack some, and the yolk held up perfectly. It was just like cracking a brand new fresh egg that a chicken had just laid. And so I'm not sure. I didn't notice that the ones on the top, the yolks were any different than the ones on the bottom. I'm not sure what was causing that difference. My theory is that the eggshells, there's a difference in how permeable they are. You'll notice that when a chicken has been given a lot of calcium, it has a really thick, nice eggshell that's harder to crack. Sometimes you'll crack an egg and it almost feels brittle, like you could just crumble it in your hands. And so my theory is that some of the more brittle shells allowed some of that cow lime mixture to permeate the actual shell and maybe affect the yolk. I don't know. There's no scientific basis in that. I just noticed, though, that when I was cracking them, it seemed like the ones with the runnier eggs were easier to crack than the ones with the firm yolk. So who knows? All I know is that regardless of how the yolk held up, they all tasted the same. They all smelled fine. It doesn't mean that it's a bad egg if you crack your water glassed egg and the yolk is not firm. And then let's talk about storage. People ask me where I stored mine. Mine actually last year, if you look right over here, I stored mine in a bucket right here last year for convenient use in my kitchen. So we would just, anytime we needed an egg, we would just reach over there and grab one out, rinse it off and crack it for whatever we needed to use it for. This year we're planning to preserve way more, and so what I will end up doing is storing the buckets where I store my excess canning jars. So just wherever your root cellar is or your food storage is, you can store the eggs right there. They don't need to be kept cool. It doesn't need to be refrigerated or anything like that. Room temperature is just fine. So hopefully this information was helpful for you if you've been kind of on the fence about doing water glassing because you weren't quite sure how the eggs would taste and how safe it would be. I give my 100% seal of approval to this preservation method for your eggs. I will never freeze eggs again. This is always how I'm going to preserve mine. I plan to preserve as many as I possibly can. I did 3 dozen today. I would love it if I could preserve an extra, 6 dozen every month, and then by the time winter rolls around, we are just set on eggs. People always ask me if we sell our extra eggs in the spring, and we don't have a chance to, because when we have an abundance of eggs, we're either preserving them or we're putting them in the incubator to hatch chicks, or we're eating them. When you have 7 kids, eggs are a great thing to feed them for breakfast. It's a good source of protein. It's perfect nutrition, and we do a lot of baking. So there are never any extras. We do, if we have a couple extra dozen in the fridge and people stop by, we tend to give them away, but we are not interested in selling them. We would rather save our excess eggs to have for the winter so that we don't have to worry about buying them in those months when our chickens aren't laying. All right, time for me to get busy. Have a blessed day, friends. I'll talk to you later.